Good day and welcome to this panel session. I'm Gareth Bloor, President of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business, and it's my great privilege to moderate this session today, joined by three dynamic individuals on the African continent, each of them committed to overcoming the barriers to prosperity and to unlock the economic growth across the continent and the incredible potential that is Africa and each of its 55 countries. Joining me is Adedayo Thomas, based out of Lagos, Nigeria, Big Daddy Liberty, based out of Johannesburg, South Africa. And then we also have Franklin Cudjoe in Accra, Ghana. I know that each of their bios are available for each one of you to take a look at just before you've joined the session or at some point during it. Mr. Adedayo Thomas has been committed to liberty, working with students and working with screening a variety of documentaries, most notably Poverty Inc., which won several awards and has been premiered, I think, hundreds of times across Nigeria. Big Daddy Liberty is the Chief Operations Officer at the IRR, South Africa's oldest classical liberal think tank, and he has taken South Africa by storm on social media as host of the Big Daddy Liberty show and a variety of other productions. And Franklin Cudjoe is a well-recognized leader based out of West Africa. He founded and directs the Imani Center for Policy and Education, and Franklin is also a member of the World Economic Forum Global Young Leaders, and his think tank is one of the top 10 recognized in Africa and routinely cited as one of the top 100 across the world. It's a pleasure to welcome each one of you. I'm going to get straight into the first question, and I'm going to start with you, Big Daddy Liberty. What are the barriers to prosperity in Africa?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. And I think the short answer to that question is definitely the state. It's always been the state. And, you know, whether you look at, or rather, when you look at the record of history in Africa in terms of post-liberation movements on the continent, it has unfortunately been the ideology, therefore, that is held within the power or the echelons of state power since liberation that have held the ordinary individual African back. You know, I always talk about Africans as being no different to any other citizen of the world, so to speak. You know, generally speaking, a rather conservative individual, you know, that sort of God-fearing, law-abiding, and family-orientated individual. However, the governments that have reigned over that particular individual, those communities, those families, have been rather leftist in nature. And it's been that, in other words, that toxic mix of leftist ideological underpinnings of post-liberation movements and governments, and of course the state, one which over-regulates, overbears on the civil liberties of the individual, the economic liberties of the individual. And you see that right throughout Africa, you know, whether it's Francophone parts of Africa or in even English-speaking parts of Africa. It's always been the state and statism and really the big man politics of Africa that has gotten in the way of that innovative African individual who looks to, you know, pursue their happiness and be prosperous.
Thank you very much. Adedayo Thomas, you've been working at this for decades out of Nigeria. What are the barriers you've been particularly focused on to unlock prosperity?
Thank you, Gareth. And queuing into what Big Daddy has said as a foundation, he mentioned the state then. But my issue has to do again with the transition of the first elites in Africa to the older one, then to the younger generation that distorted the history. In a nutshell, I'm talking about education. Education is not primarily that you have to be in the Western school or whatsoever. It has existed in the face of human race, and same thing in Africa. But then there has been a distortion of what Africa is and what the whole elites that hijacked the independence, what they now operate. So if I'm picking one after Big Daddy's mentioning of state, we should be talking about education and enlightenment of the foundation of Africa that has been distorted for another 6 steps, which is a major challenge that I can always see when it comes to the barriers in our prosperity. Other layers comes in. If you pick that one again from my own end of the education and misinformation of who we are, then you now look at the elite as well, the leaders, the ones George Aiti called the younger generation the cheetah and the other one, the cheetah and what is it called?
And that's the Hippo generation.
The Hippo generation, the old Hippo generations, yeah. And he called the younger ones the cheetah. So the Hippos are the second layers of the blade. If I cue it to what Big Daddy have said, that means they are the third layers of the blade, because what they saw coming after independence was like a free thing. So they quickly grabbed it and distorted the system of the foundation of Africa. So those 2 points, with agreeing with that of the liberty, Big Daddy, makes it 3. We can go on and go on and go on, but I want to leave the stage for maybe Franklin as well to add to the 3 points we've mentioned.
Thank you very much, Adedaya. So making that important distinction, drawing on the great intellectual George Ayiti, who notes that there's the Hippo generation, the slow-moving, statist, barriers to prosperity sort of situation, and then the cheetah generation, which I believe is a title ascribed to people like you, Franklin Cudjoe. You're running a think tank. You're focused on addressing misinformation, faulty policy solutions. What do you see as the major barriers that you've been tackling personally heading up Imani?
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be on this very interesting conversation. I think we need this often, as much as possible, to eliminate the minds of those who still believe that there is still nirvana on the continent. To answer the question directly, I think it's the growth of governments that have impeded the prosperity agenda. I mean, I take a look at my government here. Even though it promised, before it came into power, it promised to run a lean administration. And they came tripling almost the number of appointments of ministers and government appointees. In fact, we are in an election season, and you can count the number of expensive V8s costing almost $100,000 a piece. And if the president moves, there's even a chair, there's one V8 vehicle, Toyota Land Cruiser, that holds his chair, the chair he sits while he moves around the country. Now, it tells you the amount of money we spend on frivolities, and all of this is at the expense of the hardworking, backbreaking taxpayer. So the taxpayer needs to break his or her back in order to pay a tax that keeps the government running. And in the process of trying to pay the tax itself, he or she finds difficulties. The process of paying the tax, apart from the amount that are exorbitant, it's also a Herculean tax to just pay a simple tax. You have to go through hurdles. Sometimes you even have to pay a bribe in order to pay a tax. And it goes on and on. I mean, when you talk about enforcing contracts, which is one of the vital elements of an institution that's supposed to enhance prosperity, you find out that most African countries are laggards. Well, maybe countries like Rwanda and maybe some countries in the north are probably doing a bit better. But I look at Ghana as a country that is supposed to be shining the pathways to prosperity on the continent. Well, we get credit for so many things, by the way. But I was alarmed to notice that in the last Ease of Doing Business Index, which the World Bank publishes every year, last year when we were ranked 118th out of 190 economies. And as if that was not worse, I found out that enforcing contracts, we were behind Somalia. Can you imagine? Somalia, which is a country that is probably God-forsaken right now, every man to himself. I was mortified to find out that they had beat us to it when it came to enforcing contract. And I joked with my colleagues at Imani that possibly in Somalia they enforce contracts with guns. Maybe that's why it's effective. And that in Ghana we don't enforce contracts with guns. It takes you about 125% of your annual income to be able to register property. Now, almost the whole of Ghana, the capital city is Accra. Only 10% of lands in Accra are digitized, right? It's not the whole of Ghana. Just 10% of lands in Accra, the capital, are digitized. So it tells you the Herculean tax people go through when they have to just register their property, which is obviously an important institution when it comes to the issues of prosperity. And you have to pay a lot of bribes. And it just, the list goes on and on. When you come to the issues of corruption, that's even an understatement. I think we are experiencing the greatest forms of state capture after South Africa. I'm sure Big Daddy is in tune with this subject. And corruption, well, Nigerians beat us to read, by the way, but corruption seems to be one of the things that is debilitating as we speak right now. Our government is trying to sign off a very um, mouth-watering deal, royalties in gold, sign off to some fictitious entity in a safe haven, in a tax haven, and we mounted a lot of pressure to the extent that we had meetings with the finance minister, who still is adamant that you let the deal pass through. But all of this is to point to the fact that maybe this is at the higher level. There are many levels of barriers that people experience. But if people are experiencing these higher barriers at the highest level, it only tells you what people are experiencing at the decentralized level. I'm sure we can get into the nitty gritty of this conversation, at least some of the views I've made, and Thomas and Big Daddy as well.
Thank you very much, Franklin. And indeed, going back to you, Big Daddy Liberty, what is the relationship between this level of government overreach that we're hearing about, excessive taxation, incredible regulatory burdens? What's the relationship, in your view, between this and the conduciveness for corruption, which has plagued so many places? That's the first question, and then I just have a quick follow-up after that. Over to you.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, you can hear the common thread amongst all three participants, which is effectively how our societies have structured their relationship to the state. Invariably, you're hearing and you're seeing, especially in the South African case, where whenever you have a big state or a big government, one which centralizes powers, one which accords, where effectively decision-making and prosperity and advancement is based on your political clout and not necessarily what you bring to the market, whether it's a service, a good, or whatever the case may be. Whenever you have that situation, of course you'll have corruption. Of course you'll have the levels in which there are winners and losers in society. And the winners, of course, are always those who have the closest proximity to power. And this is why I often say to people, just as a quick aside, that I'm not pro-business, as an example. I'm pro-markets. There is a distinction there. You can have, like you'll have in Nigeria and in Ghana and here in South Africa, where there are very strong capital markets in some cases. However, or rather the strong businesses and businesses operating in those countries. However, invariably, some of those businesses are the most successful of them, at least, are the ones who have the closest relationship with the politicians and political elites. And that's why I totally understand what Adebayo meant when he said the elites in his society, because you'll tend to find, and I'll let him obviously make the point, that those elites are very closely aligned to the ruling elites, the political elites in that country. So to answer your question, Gareth, it's an absolutely dangerous thing to have a situation where if the state is as big as it is and power is concentrated in the hands of the state, it is often at the expense of individuals, and it opens the door to the corruption. It opens the door to officials abusing power. I mean, if you have a situation where you have governments that are taxing people to the hilt, then being a taxman in that country is a mighty powerful job to be in. And if there's very little accountability in that government, then you can be a taxman for private means, so to speak. Where yes, you collect the taxes, but none of it, or very little of it, ends up in the actual government coffers. But to come to maybe just a point I wanted to make, just to write off the last comment, often also opportunity in a society like this one is determined upon who you know in government. For instance, the very fact that Kudjo had to go to a finance minister in order to talk about a particular deal that is on the lips of everybody kind of makes you wonder, or rather, actually, sorry, I got trapped on my own sentence construction there. I want to make a bigger point, which is this. It doesn't surprise me that in a society where the state and government and power is concentrated in the hands of politicians, that ordinary people, entrepreneurs like Kudjo, have to sometimes even go to politicians in order to demand that the right thing be done in terms of allowing a society to be to compete, allowing entrepreneurs to be the ones who create wealth, and definitely not taking wealth away from productive people in order to cut these various deals that often benefit politicians and those who are close close to political power. So again, there is a strong relationship, Gareth, between the size of government, the amount of power it wields, and really the nature in which, rather, the relationship between citizens and government, with things like corruption and nepotism, and effectively the limiting of people's opportunities.
Thank you very much, Big Daddy. Adedayo, the point has been made by many that it's not free markets that are the cause of poverty, it's exclusion from these markets, followed often by the point that the Marxist view of the human person has informed, as this imported idea from outside the continent, has informed too much policy thinking. Do you agree with that? And any thoughts that you have on some of the history that's often not heard around liberty and enterprise in Africa, particularly trade?
You see, I, like I said in the first place, I will equally want to, queue up with what Franklin and Big Daddy has discussed in terms of that. If you look at our space, okay, we've had about there are a couple of challenges though, but we've had about 4 mentioned now. But I think from my own perspective of the market and economic prosperity in Africa, we should look back at bringing the Cheetah generation into understanding that Africa was founded on free market economy, property right, principle of individualism, and of course, good governance. When we're able to shift from that in totality, we've started a couple of decades, almost everybody including myself in the Liberty Forum, trying to redirect the old ways of education in terms of looking at government and expecting the state. It is the people themselves who eventually feels the state owns them a lot in terms of economic prosperity. Meanwhile, that's not Africa. We're not lazy in Africa. I think from that point of view, if you look at it, you mentioned trade as well. If you look at where we started, you see from Nigeria, people move from Nigeria to Togo, to Benin Republic, back to Burkina Faso. And you see semblance in our names. These are free movement. This is free trade. Even when we have the Free Trade Africa signatory listing, which you celebrated with me in the first place, how free are the movement as we speak? And no, that has not been entrenched. But what I principally believe is waking up now. It's easier than when we started. It's easier because of the global usage of internet, social media, and whatsoever, for the young ones to now learn more about who we are and where we're going. Under normal circumstances, I don't typically believe that somebody should come into my house and clean my house before cleaning is. So in terms of collaborations or looking at the foreign, other Western countries to develop our system, it is entirely a zero approach to me, because I don't believe, in as much as I want liberalization, I talked about it, I want free market economy, Africa to Africa, Africa to Europe, and even to other Western world. I still believe within ourselves, we should be able to, bring back that thing that brought us together pre-colonial era. We should not be talking about colonialism now, like almost all my speeches. I thought, look, it's dead. I was a part of it. I only have the history, but let the history part a better way for me. So I think in terms of that, back to my earlier point, that should be our focus. And when that becomes our focus, by the time the business grows, not the business as in what the Big Daddy means. I mean, when the free market grows within it, it moves into another country. And from that perspective, you discover that even the political and the states that we are talking about will be rendered useless by the time we are able to grow the economy, and the economy prospers in the hands of the youth. And basically, I just believe in our continuous effort, we've been doing in the past decade, that a better way, you see, a child can pick Adam Smith. When he reads it, I wonder, when I pick books like that, I think they were writing for Africa. And that's the truth. But the point is, if I should understand it, it is not everybody that needs to understand it, because we are talking about population that will not even be able to read it. Despite all, I have to give it to, well, Ghana and some other countries, despite our effort in bringing our children up, those one are even individual efforts of parents in terms of education to be able to read and write. We still have chunk of population that we need to reach about this. We have a couple of, one of the best things I can talk about my president in Nigeria so far is going back into agriculture and bringing a lot of things. How would the country how would Nigeria have survived? How would we have survived if there is no rice revolution?
Yeah,
individually growth.
Hold that point, if you would, on some of the examples, because you mentioned a few things. One of them is the importance of local institutions and the fact that there had been liberty and trade across much of Africa. I think there of Botswana, which on unbundling the colonialism, independence from Britain, went from one of the 3 poorest countries in the world to upper middle income status today. Not only that, but during the 80s, recorded the fastest growth rates of any country in the world. So there are some great success stories. But you mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is the single biggest free trade deal since the advent of the World Trade Organization. Franklin, your thoughts on the viability and the implementation? How long before we see this free movement of goods and services across the continent, given this historic deal that was signed last year?
Well, it will interest you to know that the Secretariat for the AfTA is in Ghana, and Ghana likes to pride itself of being the first to sign UN conventions and all kinds of things. While I'm happy to note that the Secretariat is in Ghana, I'm not too positive about the steps we are taking. First of all, Nigeria was dragging its feet because of its size, and Nigeria was doing so for a good reason, by the way. I'm not ready to put my good brother Abdedayo on the spot. Nigeria was very concerned about parallel importation of goods into their country, where people use other routes to import goods like rice and all manner of edibles into Nigeria. But you see, the reason why I cite these examples has not given me the needed impetus to say that, well, there's a gung-ho moment, let's not move ahead and let's do it quickly. It's because the officers of the AU are being paid for by the Chinese. Now, when I see the conversations as they go, it appears to me that we are externalizing the engagements on this Africa Free Trade Agreement to our Western friends. Not that we don't need them. We need them. But when I see countries like, the regional bloc like the Economic Community of West Africa States, which is in West Africa, virtually begging the Swiss to give them money to discuss how to remove roadblocks or trade barriers in West Africa, I cringe. Because I ask myself, what signals are we sending? Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana control the West African market. With Nigeria, almost 90%. The rest, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, just maybe 5 or 8%. Now, if these big neighbors cannot put together resources to discuss, and not just discuss, but physically remove these barriers, then I shudder to think that we are in for a long haul. Look, last 2 weeks, the Kenyan High Commissioner to Ghana invited me for a conversation, and we talked about AfTA, how to optimize the benefits of Africa Free Trade Organization. And he said something which was a bit lamenting. He said, look, you have to help us to decolonize our mentality as African brothers and sisters when we are discussing trade. And his reason was simple, that the way even our leadership treat Westerners who probably have ready money and ready endorsements and to endorse deals like the green deals and all kinds of climate actions, the way they receive them is not the same way they receive the African brethren, right? So it tells you that even the cultural issues, the soft issues that we need to be dealing with, where we identify, as Adedayo was suggesting, we have common names, we have common traits, we have common thinking, even though these traits are akin to livelihoods, because trade and trade and free movement of people do not necessarily depend on color. The point this High Commissioner was relating to is that the way we treat our own, right, speaks volumes. So the way I see, if we are, even if at this level, the soft issues we are not able to deal with, then it means that it's going to be fundamentally difficult to actually remove these physical barriers that we have. Look, ECOWAS was established in 1976, a year after I was born. As we speak, Adedayo knows this. Traveling between Accra and Nigeria, the number of roadblocks that you experience on the way is absurd, right? So we cannot just by signing some big paper, drinking champagne and wine, all of a sudden think that we have arrived. But intrinsically, it is a good thing to do. So we applaud the leaders for understanding that it is a sensible thing to do, but it must move leaps and bounds. Two years ago, I organized the Moroccans business people to come to Ghana because Morocco wanted to be a member of ECOWAS, which is the regional body. And people were wondering why I was a sellout to Morocco. I said, there's a reason why Morocco wants to access the markets of Nigeria and Ghana, because they can compete. Interest rates are lower in Morocco, and so they can compete if our interest rates in Ghana and Nigeria. Nigerian interest rates are better than Ghana. So when Ghanaian traders are trying to suck Nigerian traders from our markets, I keep telling them that, look, the reason why Nigerians are doing better in spite of your taxes when they are trading in Ghana is because your cost of doing business in Ghana is high. So we need to eliminate these things, the barriers to enterprise, the local barriers to enterprise, and look at the bigger picture, really.
Franklin, just would you define for those not familiar with ECOWAS what that trade region is?
So ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States, which is made up of 16 West African countries, Ghana, Nigeria included, and Cote d'Ivoire. Look at what Cote d'Ivoire is doing. I mean, the president is going for a third term and is breaking all the rules. I think he even rigged the elections, right?
All right, thanks very much. I just, sorry, Franklin, just because of time, I just wanted to get that definition. I've got to get to Big Daddy, but thank you very much for your inputs. I see a lot of nodding, both to what Franklin's saying as well as with Adedayo. Your initial response?
Yeah, look, I mean, they're both right. We can have these lofty agreements, which again often circulates amongst the political elites. This idea of champagne popping is actually a very good one. It's what we see, right? But the real hard work is the structural stuff that is required to enhance the freedoms and the opportunities of ordinary Africans, and that requires not strong man politics or influential so-and-sos in the world of politics, but rather strong institutions, ones which are geared towards empowering individuals. And really, I'm a classical liberal. I talk a lot about the individual, but really we're a family society. So insofar as I talk about individuals, I'm referring to the ability of families across Africa being able to build wealth and transfer that wealth to the following generation. So I'm in full agreement with the way in which the two gentlemen are phrasing the challenges we face and the everyday challenges of an ordinary entrepreneur, like Kuja, trying to move from Accra to Nigeria. It makes sense. Lagos, thanks. Sorry about that. It makes sense. I mean, I live in a part of the world where we have a regional bloc called SADC. That's the Southern African Development Community, and you have similar problems. There are on paper free movement agreements and free trade agreements, but the reality is, as an entrepreneur here in South Africa, I am more likely to trade with the Asian bloc or Europe or even America than I am with Lesotho, which is literally a country within mine. That's not a function of necessarily xenophobia or whatever the case may be, although that does rear its ugly head here in South Africa, unfortunately. But what it is the difficulty of allowing ordinary people in a society to be able to move goods and services across the country, and to found that, so to speak, as a last point, with strong institutions which allow for that and create a fairness and equality of opportunity, if you will, amongst African trading partners. So So the long and the short of it is this: if I'm to see more trade, if I'm to see a better relationship between Lagos, Accra, and Johannesburg, then what you need are the countries along that trade path, if you will, to really do the hard yards and get the work right of setting up strong institutions that allow for individuals and really families to trade more freely and to build wealth here on the continent. And we haven't seen that yet from our politicians. Again, why, Gareth? Because you mentioned it early on, of the ideology of the political elites in the country, which is yoked, unfortunately, on the left and sort of 20th century ideas of socialism and communism. We're just not seeing that fresh take that allows the individual, the cheetah generation that the good prof talks about, to be the ones who lead growth and to lead trade on the continent.
As we come to the conclusion of the panel, I'm going to be asking each of you in a moment to list your proudest achievement that you or your organization has done in overcoming these barriers to prosperity that you've outlined. But before I do that, the question to you of that, Big Daddy, is we've covered the issue of corruption, how that undermines the rule of law. We've noted the incredible amount of trade that's happened across the continent, the often unrecorded history, the importance of other issues as well, like the tax burden and how that needs to be covered. But property rights is obviously fundamental. And you sit in a country where the majority of South Africans were totally denied property rights, were stripped of those rights. And there's a situation where that's about to be further undermined. Could you just give us a little bit of background there and what work you're looking to do to maintain property rights at the forefront for people?
Yeah, I mean, the sad part is this. It's the story of Africa. And not necessarily just confined to us as South Africans. And again, it comes back to the last point I made, which is the ideology that drives the politicians who often assume power across Africa since our post-liberations across the African continent. But here in South Africa, we're seeing the effects, therefore, of a political elite in this country who are yoked in the ideas of socialism, the idea of collectivizing land, for instance, and all land resting in the hands of the state, i.e. politicians. And we're seeing that now effectively rear its head by way of a policy being proposed called expropriation without compensation, with the more sort of rabid left in the country, even going as far as saying all land should rest in the hands of the state. These policies are, again, a sad indictment on the state in which our politics rests. And what we're doing here in South Africa, I mean, there's organizations, like the Institute of Race Relations, who I used to be with, just to correct your intro earlier on. I've recently left them, but still have a very strong relationship with them, where we're fighting against these policies, which we've seen what they do in other parts of Africa. I mean, if you look at the Tanzanians and their policy of Ujamaa, it did exactly the same. Land was collectivized under the state, and you saw mass famine begin to hit those parts of the world. Ethiopia went through the same thing. I can go down the line in naming the countries that have been done this and seen the effects of it, which is to create poverty and effectively remove people's ability to create wealth. Our neighbors to the north, unfortunately, that's Zimbabwe, are the most closest example to us, where when the state is given the power, or rather, when the state is given the power to own land on behalf of people, the people are the ones who are inevitably the ones who suffer, insofar as the inability to be able to say, this is mine, this little piece of Africa, which I've fenced off, which I'm farming and producing, and from the produce I'm selling, I'm earning an income. With that income, I'm building savings. You cut that entire value chain by simply a stroke of a pen, where politicians say land and all property now rests within the state and us as politicians and not families. So the long and the short of it is we're definitely fighting it here in South Africa. My work as Big Daddy Liberty down here is to do exactly that. I travel the length and the breadth of this country. I live in my vehicle at times, literally going community to community to teach ordinary South Africans that actually ownership and power should always rest in the hands of the individual and families and not into the hands of the state.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And I think an achievement in and of itself, what you've been doing. Franklin, your think tank, again, as alluded to earlier, one of the top 10 most influential on the continent. If you could choose one example of the achievement you're most proud of, whether it's a policy reform or a campaign that has tackled these barriers to prosperity, what would that be? And any tips to others who are watching, who are on the continent, who want to see this real change and the success stories and not just ongoing marginalization from economic life? Your thoughts?
So a couple of years ago, the regulator for medicines, importation of medicines and locally manufactured produced medicines, decided to introduce a very draconian ways of regulating medicines, registering as well as continuously paying for licenses. Then we took him on. We decided that he was becoming an albatross around the neck of entrepreneurs, far from the fact that he was also communist and indeed was not interested in the issues around patents, intellectual property rights as regards the manufacture of medicines and what have you. Then we decided that we'll talk to about 60 pharmaceutical owners, pharmaceutical companies, and those who import medicines. And we carefully went through the whole licensing procedures. And when we have done publishing our report, the Parliament of Ghana set up a committee and asked us to present our findings. The Minister for Health set up a committee and asked us to present our findings. It's one of the very most modest achievements we've had. Eventually, the current medicine regulations as we speak in the country are in most significant part owed to the work we did. And eventually the man was kicked out of office. And I think for me, it's taught me a lesson in how to mobilize enormous political and economic power. Actually, first of all, economic power, because these were economic agents who were trying to eke out a living. They were being sidestepped by the political power. But we used the mobilization of these economic agents to identify an issue, went the full haul, identified the problems, and made propositions to it. In fact, there's a published paper in one of our leading newspapers called the Daily Graphic.
Fantastic.
And I can share that much later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Adedayo Thomas, I think it's safe to say you've been at this longer than any of us on the panel today. Your proudest achievement or campaign, and any lessons you'd like to impart to those watching?
Basically, you see, when I started, I talked so much about education and impacting knowledge to those coming to discover their foundation, the continent where they stay, and how they can contribute to enhance themselves and, of course, contribute to the society. The fact that the education and enlightenment campaign has to be taken down to them as being a major achievement that I've done. And in entering government, I've been able to use, just like Franklin has said, I've been able to use the economy and the political bloc to effect a change. It's for classical liberal and libertarians to equally use the government organ to effect that change. And that's exactly what I've done in the present seat, which I am in collaboration with Acton University, in terms of giving me the right to translate one of the very, very important section of Poverty Inc., which is Charity That Ought, into the local languages, which, of course, as we speak now, I've distributed over 30,000 in Yoruba language of Charity That Ought. And the Hausa language will start distribution by December or January. I've spoken to Franklin as well, how we're going to take that to Ghana, and has given me a language that is going to be. So it's a major achievement I've been able to get that right. And I've started doing the work on it, because if that is expanded to a larger number of people, using that aspect, not a textbook, it relates, theme, folktales, stories relate to individual as if it's in their blood. And when they sleep, they remember that easily, especially considering that we have a lot of old informal sector still in Africa. So it's a very good organ of instigating action into the society. And that's a very big, moderate achievement I think I've had this year.
Congratulations, Adedayo. And I do think I speak for many at Acton who are aware of that incredible achievement in getting that message across. Big Daddy Liberty, finally, over to you. Your best achievement, or at least I know you're working on a number of projects, the current issue you're working on to unleash and unblock the barriers to prosperity in South Africa.
Yeah, it's a long road. As I said, what I've actually just done is, I've given up my middle class existence, my sedentary middle class existence, and I, if you can picture it, I drive around in this massive bakkie, a truck for international audiences that's branded Big Daddy Liberty. But, it's not a dog and pony show. What it really is the hard, on-the-ground advocacy work that's required if we're going to inject these liberty ideas into communities across the country, in my case, across South Africa. We can't rely, in my case, with the traditional media. We've got to physically have and establish that relationship directly with communities, especially poorer communities, informal settlements here, and teach people about the value of liberty, the importance and the power of, the idea of building a free, prosperous, property-owning and non-racial society in our sense, given our history. And to do that, I travel across the country, as I mentioned, and the hard yards is basically disseminating material that teaches people about the power of markets, property rights, the rule of law, and it's sorry, you don't have to forgive me if I'm stumbling. It's such a hard and a large task ahead of us, but I feel as though, I'm listening to Adebayo and to Franklin, and I'm so encouraged to see fellow Africans who are doing this also on the ground level. In other words, translating a lot of these ideas and concepts into the languages of our communities. So that's definitely the work I'm also doing in this part of the world, and it sees me being on the road 24/7 and producing the show, of course, the Big Daddy Liberty Show, as another way of transmitting these ideas into the very spaces where these ideas have never been before.
Absolutely fantastic. And I have to say, each one of you remind me of the great Nobel Prize-winning economist Friedrich Hayek, who said the ideas of liberty and economic freedom need to be restated to each successive generation. And indeed, each one of you are doing that. Congratulations, Big Daddy Liberty, Adedayo Thomas, and Franklin Cudjoe. An absolute honor to interview you today. And on behalf of all watching, best wishes going forward. And thank you from the Acton Institute and from all who've been attending today. Best wishes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.